Every good speech needs transitions. A basic speech has 5 parts: an introduction, 3 main points, and a conclusion. We need to write sentences that connect those 5 parts. Speech transitions are often known as connectives. A good transition is a little bit of a break from the speech, where you let the audience know where you've been and where you're going. A popular phrase in speech writing is, tell them what you're gonna tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Speech writing is repetitive. It moves the audience's brain along with the structure of the speech. A good transition lets your audience know that there is change ahead, that you are finished with one major idea or one main point, and that you're moving on to the next major idea or main point. It's important in speech writing to always let your audience know what you're doing and where you're going, and we use transitions to accomplish that. In the basic speech course, most instructors acknowledge that there are 4 types of transitions that students use in speeches, and most of us would like to see you use all 4 of these in your speech for the basic speech course, so you can demonstrate that you know how to make transitions from one idea to another, and that you know how to do it creatively and differently under different circumstances. In order to explain and demonstrate these 4 types of transitions, I'm going to use an outline. This outline is on a speech about wave power, creating energy by harnessing the power of our ocean's waves. And you'll notice there are 3 main points: what wave power is, the types of wave power, and the pros and cons of using wave power to generate electricity. I also want you to pay particular attention to the sub-points. Notice that under main point 1, what wave power is, we have 2 sub-points: basic structure and history. Main point 2, the types of wave power, we have 3 types of wave power: oscillating, floating systems, and tapered channels. And then finally, on our main point number 3, under pros and cons, we have 2 subpoints: pros and cons. Transitions are used as a springboard into a main point. So sometimes we use what's called a simple transition. Our first main point on our sample speech is what wave power is. So we mention that before we actually jump into the main point. So we might say, first, let's look at what wave power is, or in my first point, I will cover what wave power is. Notice there's no mention of the subpoints. If you were to do a simple transition into our second main point, which is the types of wave power, it might sound like this. Let's now turn our attention to the types of wave power. Our next type of transition is called an internal preview. It's also used as a springboard into a main point. But what makes it different than a simple transition is that you mention the subpoints. Remember when I said we tell them what we're going to tell them, then we tell them what we told them? Well, this concept of internal previewing is telling your audience what you're going to tell them. So previewing is a type of forecasting. It's dragging your audience along so they know exactly where you're going. In our introduction, we do a main preview, where in the end of the introduction, you tell your audience members what your main points are going to be. Well, with internal previews, they function in the same way, except instead of telling your audience what your main points are going to be, you're telling your audience what your sub-points are going to be. On our sample speech about wave power, the 2 sub-points of the first main point are basic structure and history. So an internal preview might sound like this. In order to gain insight into how wave power can potentially revolutionize the way we create electricity, we must first describe it by looking at its basic structure and its history. Notice I've underlined basic structure and history. That's what makes it an internal preview. Once again, what makes this sentence an internal preview is that it incorporates the 2 subpoints. Notice the subpoints for main point number 1 are basic structure and history. And what this internal preview does is forecasts that those are the 2 things we're going to be talking about. The second example on this page is for a persuasive speech. Imagine that the main point is problems, and there are 3 problems with bungee jumping: faulty equipment, lack of regulation, and lack of training. So to internally preview that main point of problems, we construct a sentence that looks like this. The problems associated with bungee jumping are threefold. They include faulty equipment, lack of regulation, and a lack of training. If you're understanding internal preview, then understanding internal review, or sometimes known as internal summary, should be pretty easy. Remember we said in good speech writing, we tell them what we're going to tell them, we tell them, and then we tell them what we told them. Well, what an internal review or summary does is summarizes. It tells your audience what you told them. It's placed at the end of the main point and reviews the subpoints that were just covered. If you recall, our sample speech, main point 2, was the types of wave power, and there are 3 different types of wave power that you might cover in your speech. Well, in order to help your audience make sure they understood what they heard, you might do an internal review at the end of that main point. With a better understanding of water columns, buoys, and channel systems, let's finally swim to shore and discuss the negative and positive aspects of wave power. Notice that internal review is in the past tense. Let's take a look at the second example on this page. Now that we've looked at fingerprints, hand geometry, and the eyes, we must look at both the advantages and disadvantages of this technology. Notice that is an internal review and an internal preview combined into one transition. These types of transitions make it crystal clear where you've been and where you're going. And if you look at the third example on this page for a persuasive speech on bungee jumping, you'll see that this is a combination of an internal review and a simple transition. With a clear understanding of bungee jumping's faulty equipment, lack of regulation, and lack of training, there's your internal review. We can now jump to the causes of this problem. And saying jump to the causes is a simple transition. It's important to note that what makes we can now jump to the causes of this problem a simple transition is that there is no mention of the subpoints. Now, if I were to then go on and list the 3 causes of the problem, then that simple transition would become an internal preview. Our final transition is more transitional. It's called a signpost. Now, like a signpost in your neighborhood, it tells you where you are in the neighborhood. You look up at the sign, you know you're at 5th and Oak Street. Well, a signpost in a speech does the same thing. It tells you where you are in the speech. It quite often manifests itself in some sort of numbering, 1st, 2nd, 3rd. Many instructors, like myself, require that students signpost their preview statement, meaning they used 1st, 2nd, 3rd as they do the main preview of their speech. This example is from one of my favorite speeches, and it was on tailgating. And this student's main points were the origins of tailgating, the current state of tailgating, and then the products that have kind of grown out of this concept of tailgating. As you've likely already learned, at the end of the introduction, you tell your audience what your main points are going to be. This is telling your audience what you're going to tell them. Notice in this preview statement, I underlined the signposts, 1st, 2nd, and finally. This helps your audience to understand what the 3 main points of the speech are going to be. Well, that's transitions. I don't want you to forget about your transitions. They're an important part of a speech. They are the glue that holds a speech together, that makes your audience understand where you're going and where you've been. Good luck, and write great transitions.